I've called this tilting the balance, and I'll just say that in the mid to late 80s in Manitoba, a nonpartisan consensus emerged that when it came to regulating crown monopolies, that we needed a stronger independent voice, the Public Utilities Board. And that kind of consensus has stayed strong in Manitoba through various governments of various political orientation from 1988 really up until 2019, 2020. What I see in Bill 36, and many others do as well, is tilting the balance away from independent rate setting. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why the Public Utilities Board is there, that historical consensus under which it emerged, and some of the implications of Bill 36 for it. So if Trish wants to move to slide 2, we'll enter the arcane world of public utilities boards. And you've probably guessed I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to these boards, but the Public Utilities Board of Manitoba is fundamentally important and affects a lot of us every day in when we turn on our power, or in terms of the prices we pay. And here are some of its key roles. It reviews and sets rates for essential public services such as hydro, Central Gas, Manitoba Public Insurance, as well as for a number of smaller utilities, including Stitco up in Manitoba's north. And it also sets rates also for certain municipal water utilities, although not for the city of Winnipeg. It also provides advice to government. When we're trying to reduce our energy demand in Manitoba, it provides advice on Efficiency Manitoba's 3-year plans. And when we're trying to protect our most vulnerable consumers, at the request of government, it can provide advice about payday lending rates. And when the Manitoba government was planning to build major projects such as Bipole 3, Kiosk, and Kanawapa, the Public Utilities Board was there also to give independent evidence-based advice driven by its own expertise and the many experts it calls before us. So that's the Public Utilities Board at a very high level. And if we go to slide 3, you might ask, why do we have a PUB? Why can't just government set rates for Manitoba Public Insurance or for Manitoba Hydro? Public utilities boards have been around in North America for many years, certainly dating back to at least the early 1900s. And they're there when the market is not. They're there when we have monopolies, whether natural monopolies like hydro transmission and generation, or legislated monopolies like we do in Manitoba, like auto insurance. And it's also there, and public utilities boards are there when we have imperfect markets like payday lending, where the vulnerability of people who use payday loans is so inherent and the marketplace is so imperfect that government rate regulation is required. So that's kind of the basic backdrop to public utilities boards. But the consensus that emerged in Manitoba really emerged in the mid to late 80s because governments were playing politics with rates for crown monopolies. And I'm reminded that I'm no longer even close to the youngest person in the world. And to many of you here, the 1980s are a distant time. But back in the 1980s, governments were playing politics with hydro and Manitoba Public Insurance in a couple of ways. One is, in circumstances where rate increases were required, but it was an election year, they avoided raising rates. And we saw that in Manitoba in the 1980s, and even as recently as the 2000s, and we saw it in British Columbia all through the 2010s. They were also playing politics with crown corporations by allowing cross-subsidization, really acute cross-subsidization to take place. The legendary story from the 1980s is about farm trucks who were paying far less than the costs they brought to the public insurance system because farmers were a politically important group. I've got nothing against farmers, I'm a farmer's son myself. My brother is a farmer. But what was happening is because no one wanted to piss off the farmers, they were paying far less in insurance premiums than the risk they brought to the system would suggest. So that's Public Utilities Board 101, why we have them, protect from monopolies, take the politics out of rate setting. But the systems really become to be valued by a lot of different folks, certainly by my clients, the Consumers Coalition, as well as large industrial customers, and even the financial markets, because it provides all of us comfort that decision-making for these monopolies is evidence-based, and that there will be some rigor and stability over time. And we know that even behind closed doors as we speak, bond rating agencies and others are telling the government of Manitoba that they really value the independence of the Public Utilities Board, and they value the rigor that the Public Utilities Board brings to rate setting in Manitoba. And another more pragmatic reason that we do have independent regulation is that it gives government political distance from unpopular decisions, because the decisions of the Public Utilities Board, evidence-driven as they are not always popular. And for governments, it provides that kind of essential distance or shield from public discontent. Slide 4, please. On this slide, Public Utilities Board sounds incredibly complex. If you went to a hearing in the old days when we had paper, you might see tens of thousands of pages of paper. A room full, the good Lord help us, of accountants, economists, and actuaries, kind of a scary sight with some engineers thrown in for good cause. But really, Public Utilities Board regulation comes down to 5 pretty simple questions. 1, are your forecasts reasonable? Can we rely on what you're saying about inflation or other factors, how much demand there is going to be for electricity? Are you spending wisely, prudently and reasonably? Question number 3, are your decisions balanced? Are you protecting captive ratepayers? And are you also keeping an eye on the well-being of the corporation? Going back to the farm truck example, are you sharing costs fairly among different types of consumers so that people are bringing the relative cost or paying in terms of the relative cost that they bring to the system? And do your rates send appropriate financial and sustainability signals to consumers about the costs of using the product? And at a high level, our clients probably, when they're at the Public Utilities Board, you see them most often fighting to keep rates low, to make sure that needless rate increases aren't imposed on consumers. But the real question before the Public Utilities Board and the principle of fairness there, in the way that it's understood there, is that consumers should not pay too much, but they also should not pay too little. They shouldn't put, for the benefit of today, avoid costs that are being incurred today, which will have to be paid for in the future. So that's that balancing act. Our clients most often are there fighting to keep rates lower, but sometimes, especially in election years, they're there saying that it would be more fair to give the utilities a bit more this year, so that consumers 3 or 4 years down the line don't have to pay a lot more. Next slide, please. Just a couple last points I want to make about the Public Utilities Board. We're an amazing province. Our crown corporations are full of people with dedication, passion, and a lot of ability. But from time to time, we're pretty insular. And one of the amazing things that the Public Utilities Board does is bring some of the best experts from across North America to bring their dispassionate views as outsiders, but based upon deep expertise in the relative industry, whether it's hydro or auto insurance. And I've used 2 examples on this page just to give an illustration of this. Both are from the 2018 decision. In the first quote on this page, the Public Utilities Board is looking at hydro's day-to-day capital expenditures. When I say day-to-day, that doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal. But if you add it up, cash flow-wise, about $600 million a year are spent on transmission lines and distribution lines, not in any big capital project, but just keeping the lights on. And one of the long-standing challenges with hydro is that it hasn't done a very good job of optimizing those expenditures and delivering bang for the buck. So here's the Public Utilities Board saying, we accept the input of Metzco, internationally known corporation, in terms of looking at managing day-to-day capital expenditures. And they're saying hydro's not doing a good job of managing its expenditures. In the second quote, they're talking about the financial markets. And Manitoba Hydro in this hearing was coming in and saying we need 7.9% rate increase this year, and we're likely to need it for the next 5 years. So almost 8% a year for 6 years, because we need to reach this magic debt equity target of 75-25. And what the Public Utilities Board was saying, no, we've got evidence from Morrison Park based upon what the capital markets are actually saying to it, and saying that there's no way that hydro needs that amount of money, or that it needs a debt equity target of 75-25 to have affordable access to capital. So that's just a couple of examples of drawing on expertise where the Public Utilities Board, in its independent way, says no to large monopolies. Slide 6. So what has the Public Utilities Board done for us lately? I think everyone, not everyone, but many people enjoy getting their Manitoba Public Insurance rate rebate when it happens. Since the year 2000, there's been about $1 billion of them. And that seems like a nice check for, at least from some consumers' perspective, to get. But I assure you that that was hard fought over every time. Certainly the first decade that we started getting these rebates, it was a hard fought battle to put money back in consumers' pockets. One thing that I think many Manitobans can thank the Public Utilities Board for was back in 2014, it looked at a $10.5 billion capital project of Manitoba Hydro called Kanawapa and said, too much risk in the marketplace. You're not doing enough Manitoba Hydro to lower demand. We don't recommend this. And the government of the day accepted its advice. As I just mentioned, the Public Utilities Board said no to Hydro's plans just back in 2018 to raise rates by almost 8% a year for 6 years. Beyond the money, the Public Utilities Board, because it draws on that expertise and from the insight of consumers, whether they're Northern First Nations or inner city residents or from large industrial consumers, we do a lot of learning there. The idea of integrated resource planning, the idea that it's not just about building new generation in Manitoba, we should be looking at alternative sources of energy, including solar and geothermal. The idea that sometimes instead of building more, we should conserve more, integrated resource planning. That's something the Public Utilities pushed hard and was underlying the rejection of the Kanawapa plant, and a more modern approach to how we do day-to-day expenditures. So apart, as I said, from the money, there's a lot of education going on at the Public Utilities Board, both of the monopolies and of the stakeholders, again, whether large industry, Northern First Nations, Southern First Nations, or consumers, other consumers. Slide 7, please. So Bill 36, and when I'm talking about Bill 36, it's a big bill. There's a lot of moving parts in it, but I've chosen and I've been asked to focus on what are Bill 36's implications for rate setting. I probably could have given you 7 or 8. I tried to highlight the top 4. And certainly from my perspective and the perspective of my clients, Bill 36 really tilts the balance away from independent rate setting to a significantly increased role for elected officials. And here's four of the main reasons I say this. We talked a lot about debt equity targets already, but historically, when it comes to rate setting, it has been the Public Utilities Board that looks at what kind of financial targets Manitoba Hydro needs for rate setting purposes that will still keep the lights on, make sure everyone's paid, and also make sure that the financial markets have confidence in hydro. And I use the example from 2018 when the Public Utilities Board said, no way, you don't need 8% rate increases because you have to meet this 75-25 debt equity target. Well, Bill 36 takes away that, that authority of the Public Utilities Board for rate setting purposes to choose the financial targets for hydro that it will use for the purposes of setting rates. The heart of the Public Utilities Board process is the Public Utilities Board looking at what Manitoba Hydro says its need, testing it vigorously, listening to different stakeholders, including consumers, and coming up with a rate. What Bill 36 makes another significant change for consumers in that it puts in a rate cap determined by the legislature rather than through evidence. It also provides that hydro rates cannot be reduced for imprudent expenditures approved by the Treasury Board. Now, these three changes that I've been talking about now, they're scheduled to come into effect in April 2025. What Bill 36 also does is says that when it comes to setting rates for Centra Gas, the rules for determining those rates will be left up to the cabinet. So what you see here on slide 7 is 4 examples of where the authority of the Public Utilities Board is being significantly reduced. The strength of independent rate setting is being significantly reduced, and it's tilting towards elected officials. People in this conversation and otherwise will have different views of that, but I just remind you that when we started really focusing on independent regulation in the mid to late 1980s, that's because Manitobans were becoming concerned that politicians were playing politics with the rates for monopolies. Just on slide 8, I just want to talk through the debt equity target. And debt equity is not the easiest concept to explain, but let's say that Manitoba Hydro's, it's the total value of all its plant in operation is about 32 million. That means that a 25-75 debt equity target or debt to equity target would mean that if you've got 32 million in capital, 25% of that, about $8 billion would have to be in equity and retained earnings. What Bill 36 sets out a debt equity target for hydro of 80% by March 31st, 2035, and 70% by March 31st, 2040. In essence, it means Manitoba Hydro's got around $3 billion worth of equity right now. By 2040, it would need another $5 billion worth of revenue. Where's that money going to come from? Some might come from export sales, but a lot of it's going to come out of the pockets of Manitoba consumers. So what this change in the legislation means is that this debt equity target is likely to be a very significant driver of rate increases. And as I've said before, the Public Utilities Board in an independent evidence-based process has said Manitoba Hydro doesn't need it to access capital in the capital markets. Slide 9. Manitoba Hydro, the Bill 36 also sets a rate cap for hydro rates. It says that in any particular year, rates have to be 5% or inflation, the lesser of. to a lot of consumers, maybe that sounds like a good thing, that rates are capped at a certain level. What that means mathematically this year, when inflation in May on a year-over-year average was 7.7%, is that hydro rate increases this year could be as high as 5%, whether or not Manitoba Hydro actually requires that to meet its needs. So that's at the high end of having an inflation cap, whether or not Manitoba Hydro needs it may be of concern. But as I said a few minutes ago, from my client's perspective, we want to not pay more. Our clients want to pay not 1 cent more than they need to, but not 1 cent less. And I'll simply say at times of low inflation, those really ambitious hydro financial targets that we were just talking about on the previous page, Manitoba Hydro can't meet them if rates are capped at 2%. So from our client's perspective, and certainly from my perspective, there's a huge mathematical problem at the heart of Bill 36. And that is, it can't meet its high financial targets in low inflation times. And of course, if it, the other key threat from the ratepayer perspective is that at high inflationary times, Manitoba Hydro is probably going to have to collect a lot more money than it needs to keep the lights on and to access the financial markets because of those very aggressive financial targets. Again, Manitobans have benefited from the Public Utilities Board taking an evidence-based look at those issues rather than have these targets set by legislation as Bill 36 proposes to do. Slide 10. While there's an overall cap in Bill 36 of 5% or inflation, again, in this year, the maximum rate increase could be as much as 5%. That's an overall revenue requirement. For individual classes of consumers, rates could still rise above 5%. So let's say that in 2022-23, Manitoba Hydro wanted and had an overall rate increase of 5% and had an overall rate increase of 5%, it could, the Public Utilities Board could choose to have 3% for large industrials, 7% for residential. I'm not saying that would happen. It's just a fact when we look at Bill 36, that overall rate cap is at an aggregate level. Certain groups of consumers may pay more or less than that 5%. Slide 11. I talked quite a few slides ago about how the management of day-to-day expenditures at Manitoba Hydro is really important. And cash flow wise, about $600 million a year goes to these day-to-day capital expenditures. And how the Public Utilities Board has helped to protect Manitobans for many years, because if the PUB determines that hydro spending imprudently, what it can do is lower rates accordingly. And what Bill 36 does is say that for rate setting purposes, final approval of capital expenditures doesn't go to the Public Utilities Board, it goes to Treasury Board. And what this provision in front of us on slide 11 says is the regulator may not reduce for rate setting purposes the amount required to support the capital expenditure program approved by Treasury Board. So that's another big change. And again, one that takes away from the authority of the independent Public Utilities Board. Slide 12, please. And just in terms of natural gas rates, just to highlight what I said a few minutes ago, in that the provincial cabinet, rather than the Public Utilities Board, will be setting the rules in terms of the process for setting rates for natural gas. Just before we go to our final slide, the last thing I want to say is I talked a lot about the advantage of the Public Utilities Board in terms of protecting consumers, relying on evidence, and also mutual learning. What I neglected to mention was transparency and the idea that our precious crown corporations and how they're managed and where they're spending money is vigorously tested in a public, transparent forum, which is not there for partisan reasons in terms of decision making. And I think that's another significant value of the rate setting process. Slide 13 asks, what have Manitobans told us about independent rate setting? And in 2020, our clients worked with Probe Research and did a very extensive questionnaire, but one of the questions was, who should set rates for publicly owned crown corporations in Manitoba? And there was a really strong message from citizens that they were most likely to prefer an independent arm's-length commission or board. Just a bit over one half said that independent bodies like the PUB should set rates. About a quarter of those we surveyed said it should be the Crown Corporation, and about 1 in 10 said it should be the Premier and their cabinet. So that's from 2020. I can let you know that our clients are doing or have sponsored a survey that was out in the field in June of 2022. It asked the exact same question. And I won't share the results. Those will be shared a bit later this month. But I will say that the powerful message that you see on this page about what Manitobans have told us is important to them in terms of rate setting and independent rate setting has been strongly reinforced by Manitobans today. Again, thanks so much for bearing with me. Talking about debt equity is never the most joyful subject for anyone, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the importance of the Public Utilities Board for independent rate setting, as well as some of the implications from Bill 36. And I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, Byron. So Josh is going to ask some questions from the chat. And if you have some questions that you'd like to add, please add them to the chat function.
Thanks so much, Trish and Byron. That was a really enlightening presentation, and I know we're all we've all absorbed a lot of information here. One question we have from the audience is, or from the participants, is about the 70% capitalization rule. So is the 70% capitalization ratio by March 31st, 2040 financial target reasonable and achievable? And where did this target come from?
Yeah, okay, well, it came from Manitoba Hydro's wish list. So that's Manitoba Hydro loves targets like that because they're the gift that keep on giving, in the sense that, you know, I tried to explain the math at a very high level. If you're going to get to 70-30, they're going to need another $5 billion in revenue from somewhere. And so that basically helps them to kind of check off a box that no matter what else is going on, a lot of that will come through consumer rate increases. We had this outstanding from Morrison Park back in 2018, and they really tested the veracity of financial targets like this. They spoke a lot with the financial markets themselves. They looked at how crown corporations or federally owned utilities in the United States access capital in the capital markets. And they found that targets like this were not necessary, like debt equity target, to access capital in the financial markets. What the markets were looking for was, can utilities like Manitoba Hydro, can they cover their interest rates? Do they have a friendly regulator like the Public Utilities Board is to swoop in if there's bad events like a drought? And also in the case of Manitoba, is the province of Manitoba itself backing hydro's debt through, and they do in Manitoba through what is called a debt guarantee fee. So some utilities in the United States and Canada were at 90% debt, 10% equity, and had amazing access to the financial markets. Some were at 60-40 and didn't have as good of access to the financial market because they didn't have a province backing them, or they didn't have a friendly regulator. So what the 70-30 is not necessary for Manitoba Hydro to get high quality access to the financial market. And just, sorry, Josh, I do obsess about this. Manitoba Hydro has been out there borrowing at really amazing returns, less than 4% on some really long-term debt, with a debt equity ratio of 90-10, with a lot more debt than what they're aiming for here. So 70-30 would make Manitoba Hydro's board very happy, but it's not what they need to access capital in the capital markets.
Great. That's, you know, I'm sure there's a lot more we can go into on that question, but that gives us a little bit of background there. Another question Laura asks is, I heard the government say it is doing us a favor by limiting rate increases to 5% or the rate of inflation. 5% seems high. How does a 5% rate increase compare to the history of rate increases in the past?
I think, Josh, as you can tell, I'm pretty freaking old. So I've been around rate regulation since the mid-1990s. And I can think of maybe 2 or 3 times when rate increases have been as high as 5%. There was one for MPI in around 1996, and there was one for Manitoba Hydro in 2004, coming off a huge drought. So they're rare, and they would be at the outer extreme of where rates should be. And in high inflationary times, you can't tell me that Manitoba Hydro's costs this year are rising by 5%. You know, they've got collective bargaining agreements where rates are where salaries are probably rising by a couple percent. So 5% is the PUB would typically use that as a rule of thumb. Beyond that would be rate shock. So I don't think they're pretty rare that we would have rate increases in the range of 5%.
Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to check in with Trish, where are we at for the schedule here? Do we have time for a couple more questions, or how is this working?
We have a time for a couple more questions, so 1 or 2, and then, you know, been a lot of learning and a great presentation, but 1 or 2 more questions, and then.
For sure. Thanks so much. So one question is, how would Hydro distribute any hypothetical additional profits it reaped?
So I think Manitoba Hydro, first of all, to the extent that its revenues are higher, it would traditionally pay down debt. But you do have to realize Manitoba Hydro, its revenues are in the range of $2 billion a year. About this year, close to 500 million of that, so about a quarter of that, is going to government already, in terms of when Manitoba guarantees Hydro's debt, it gets a 1% debt guarantee fee. When the water runs through Kiosk or Wisquatam, Manitoba, the province of Manitoba gets water rentals, and Manitoba Hydro also pays large corporation capital tax. So in terms of where positive net income goes, it would go to debt reduction, but Manitoba Hydro is a significant source of revenue to the province of Manitoba, and significant even compared to relatively to jurisdictions like Quebec and British Columbia. though there's also a lot of revenue that goes to government from those crown corporations, but Manitoba Hydro is right up there.
And there's a question about why does the government need to interfere in crown corporations where the PUB has been managing so well?
That is the zillion-dollar question. And through the rumor mill, we're hearing that a number of elected officials who belong to the government are asking that same question, as well as senior public servants. I think, I'm hypothesizing here. I think if you go back to that 2018 hearing, they wanted the Hydro Board wanted 7.9% rate increases. The PUB and that 75-25 debt equity target, the PUB said no. It's hard for me to speculate on why government does this. They're claiming it's cost effective, but the numbers that they're using in terms of the cost of hydro hearings are grossly inflated. And we did a study, we had an independent expert look at this just a couple of years ago. And they said for, on average, regulatory hearings over a 5-year period cost consumers about $1.50 a year, but save them $50 a year. So that's from the hydro perspective. So from our client's perspective, that's pretty good value for leaving aside government accountability and transparency. There was some pretty meaningful savings for consumers.
Yeah, $1.50 versus $50. I think that's money on the kitchen table, as they say. Just one other question. Before we conclude, I just said one more question in the chat here. Does the PUB protect the corporations as well as consumers? It would seem that the bond rating agencies see the PUB role as vital to protecting capital assets of publicly held corporations.
Yeah, and that is the essential question. The Public Utilities Board, its whole job is to balance it. And some years my clients are really mad with it. Like last year, they gave Hydro 3.6%. Our clients thought they should only get 2%, but the board wanted to be a little more cautious in a drought. The Public Utilities Board is not doing its job unless like everyone's mad at them, but Manitoba Hydro is able to access capital in the capital markets quite easily under the Public Utilities Board's supervision. And its job, the heart of it, is to achieve that balance. And I'll just use one more example, Josh. I know in my time, at least twice, maybe 3 times, Manitoba Public Insurance came in asking for very low rate increases, and the Public Utilities Board gave them more than they asked for to protect them because rates were being political. It was an election year, and the Crown monopoly was asking for too little, presumably because they didn't want to piss off electors. And our clients actually supported the Public Utilities Board in those couple of years. So that's a fine example of where the Public Utilities Board protected the Crown monopoly from itself.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to take my prerogative as the question moderator to ask just one final question myself, if that's all right with you. And that's around that gap that you mentioned between the 70% target and that math gap.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people I know have been concerned about risks of privatization of hydro. How does that math gap fit into potential concerns around hydro privatization, partially or fully?
Oh, sure, Josh. Ask me that question. Look, I can't speak to the agenda of government when it comes to privatization. All things being equal, a more handsome bottom line probably makes it more attractive to investors. But it's hard for me to really go into that. I'm not sure why they're doing it, to be quite honest, Josh. So I'm not sure I can offer a lot of light for that. Sorry about that.
That's fine. I don't expect you to be able to answer every question, but for those of us who do have further questions, we'll keep this conversation going. But that's it for the formal questions for today. So I'll pass it back to Trish to conclude this.
Thanks, Josh. And I'll take the prerogative of asking one more question from the chat, because I know that there's a lot of memory between Byron and Peggy, I see on the line at the PUB. Is this the first time that government has tried to tie the hands of the Public Utilities Board?
No, this is the third kick at the cat with this particular legislation. But even, you know, those rate rebates that we're so happy to get from MPI, or at least some people are. There were efforts a few years ago by the government to set the financial targets for Manitoba Public Insurance as well, for rate setting purposes. And the Public Utilities Board, with some advice from our clients, found that the government was acting beyond its authority in doing so. I can think of at least 4 times in the last few years. But I do want to just go back to the point that the legislation that really helped us get an independent oversight of the Public Utilities Board was brought in by a provincial government of one political persuasion, and upheld by the other government for many years. Like, there has been a strong consensus in Manitoba from 1988, from Gary Filman and Clayton Manis through Gary Dewar, through Greg Selinger, supporting independent rate regulation, so across party lines for many years.
It's always great to know the history, and certainly I'm the one who pointed out that my students, I teach at university, think that the 80s, well, the 80s were long before they were born. So the 80s are ancient history to them. So Byron's earlier comment involves a conversation we had about that, but it's very important to remember the 80s when a lot of things were happening. I'd like to thank Byron for this wonderful, thoughtful presentation, for taking the time out on the last Wednesday of June to share his experience and information with us, and a lot of the evidence-based research that he and his clients have collected and brought before the Public Utilities Board, and given us some information about Bill 36. For people who are still with us, what can you do? If you visit the Coalition's website, which is protectpub.ca, there's a letter writing tool. So you can send a letter to your MLAs and, you know, add the information that you think is most relevant to your position about Bill 36. You'll find more information about Bill 36 at that website. And please consider signing up to speak at committee. When this bill goes to second reading in late September or early October, we can flood committees like was done with the education bills of the past. And so that would send a strong signal to government if people are concerned about Bill 36. So again, there's more information on the website, and we'll keep adding information throughout the summer and in early September to keep the momentum going. I'd like to thank everyone on behalf of this very broad coalition for sharing your time with us tonight.